Hi, and welcome to a panel in the Random Fandoms series from the Billings, Montana Public Library, produced in cooperation with Con-Tinual, the con that never ends. My name is Michael G. Williams. I write urban fantasy, horror, and science fiction, and I am now going to pitch to everyone else on the panel to introduce themselves. I'll call it out because everybody sees each other in different order on these things. So, Natanya, please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Natanya Barron. I am mostly a writer of dark fantasy, but occasionally write other things. And I've been writing for about 10 years professionally, which is pretty exciting. And I'm really excited to be part of this panel, Michael.
Awesome. Tracy, introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Tracy Holt. I'm one of the hosts and producers of a podcast called Diversity Issues. We read and talk about we talk about social issues primarily after reading various indie comics and things that are approached there. We also like to talk about diversity and representation. We like to focus on creators and characters from marginalized groups.
Lindsay, introduce yourself.
Hey everybody, I'm Lindsay G. I am a writer of nonfiction and fiction and anything else that I can get my hands on. And I'm also the editor-in-chief and co-founder of Oneshi Press, which is a small indie publisher primarily of comics and graphic novels, and also the occasional illustrated fantasy novel based in Missoula, Montana.
Great. And Gretchen, introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Gretchen Evans. I write queer romance. I'm also a former con runner where we used to do fun panels similar to this and talk about queer representation in media and what was happening and changing there. So I'm excited to be here kind of with both hats on as a consumer and as a creator.
And in fact, I kind of think of this panel as a reunion for that con. So it's very close to my heart. So our topic today is finding ourselves in fandom, and specifically around queer identities, LGBTQIA+ identities, and how participating in fandom or helping create elements of fandom have been an opportunity to express that and find ourselves in that, and some of the problems in that. So the first question that I'm going to ask for the panel is, what was the first fandom that awakened you to yourself or in which you saw yourself? And what about it appealed to you? And because I hate when moderators ask a question and then immediately expect somebody else to have a ready answer, I'll answer first so that people can think if they want to. Mine probably was Star Trek, and specifically the character of Spock, because he was valued, but he was also kind of reviled. He was different from everyone around him in every way. There was no community where he really felt like he fit in. And as a kid, that really spoke to me in a lot of ways. As a kid who knew early that he was queer and growing up in a very non-friendly, intolerant environment in a very rural part of Appalachia, that really spoke to me. Plus, they had cool stuff. And I had this like big fantasy from probably the age of 4 or 5 of the ship showing up and whisking me away. And I get to go around, run around with the crew of the Enterprise. Also, it had shirtless Sulu, which was a moment of awakening for me. But I also saw myself in a lot of queer-coded villains. You know, I saw myself to some degree in Magneto. I saw myself to some degree in Prince John from the 1938 Robin Hood movie. I saw myself to some degree in Count Baltar in Original Recipe BSG. A lot of the Original Recipe Battlestar Galactica villains were very flamboyant, and they were people who had decided that they wanted what they wanted and the rest of the world could take a hike. And that's something that always spoke to me as a kid about queer-coded villains. And also Rizzo from Grease. The song There Are Worse Things I Could Do really spoke to me as a kid, to the point that when I was in a production of Grease in high school and we went to the mall to try to sell tickets, I stood on a display in a Belk store and sang There Are Worse Things I Could Do Than Go With a Boy or Two, and sold out of tickets. Thank you very much. So those are some of the things that were my initial experiences in fandom that really allowed me to see myself. Natanya.
Sure. Well, I'll echo. There's kind of two sides to that, right? I think I, like you, I think we're about the same age, very, very close in age. And for me, it was the next generation in terms of an awakening. I would certainly say, as a bisexual individual, the Deanna Troi existing was a rather awakening for me, and kind of going, okay, I kind of dig Riker and I kind of dig her, and I'm really confused. And this is interesting as someone who took a long time to really connect all the dots, because I was just not in a, like you said, kind of not in an area that would have made sense for me to be out in that particular way. But I remember being like, 7, 8 years old and watching this and being like, I think she's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen in my life. And she was this sensitive, intriguing, incredibly smart woman who, I don't think she's necessarily considered a queer icon, but I think for a lot of bisexual women out there, it was kind of like, definitely something to think about. I think for me, it was a little bit less fandom, because I read a lot of novels. So, a lot of my fandoms are really not necessarily as mainstream, but in terms of seeing myself in a series, was certainly Kushiel's Dart by Jacqueline Carey was the first time that I read not only just the fact that, queer characters could exist on all kind of parts of a spectrum, but done in such a way that was, beautiful and empowering, and sexuality was not demonized. Like you said, so much of the queer coded characters that I had read or seen in media were generally villains. This was not that way at all. And from a feminist perspective, a woman's sexuality was not considered something against them. It was actually a powerful, holy, really, moving part of her agency. And that was definitely the biggest shift for me in terms of my own reading and fandom.
Tracy, how about you?
So a few things come to mind. One thing that comes to mind is it's the first book, or it was the first of anything I ever consumed that had a queer main character, and it was Luck in the Shadows by Lynn Llewellyn. Came out in the mid-90s. And the character Alec, I really identified with deeply. I was about 14, 15 at the time. And, he was from this rural area and like basically being rescued from this dungeon by, this dashing rogue. And, I wouldn't have minded being rescued around then. I didn't come out till years later, but it definitely added to some cognitive dissonance. I can't help but chime in with the Star Trek as well. I actually have a different take on Spock. Spock and Data were two that I kind of tried to emulate in a lot of ways, because like being young and having these feelings that I was taught were bad, and so trying to suppress those feelings, and these two that either A, didn't express or didn't experience feelings, it definitely, in some ways I tried to emulate that, but also, and that led to some problematic stuff, but also I got a lot of really positive things from those two. It's like, even though negative things culture drove me to those two, I gained a lot of positive stuff from them, I think.
Yeah. Lindsay, how about you?
Well, I'm just going to dive right back in with Star Trek. I had a very
I feel like
similar...
this could be a whole other panel.
Yeah, right. I know.
Seriously.
We could have just done Star Trek as this, but that,
We could have a whole panel on Deanna Troi. I had a very similar experience to Natanya, just being so drawn to the character of Deanna Troi. And at that time, I was pretty young, and I couldn't figure out what it was exactly that made me want to be her and also want to be with her. But I think that was probably one of my earliest inklings that something was not entirely straight. And also Labyrinth. It's actually been interesting. I've been thinking about this for the past week or so, about how I think Labyrinth had a huge impact on my development and my orientation, but it was hard to figure out why exactly. Because I was extremely drawn to Jareth, the Goblin King, but he's male, and so that isn't exactly a queer, an obviously queer attraction. But over the years, I've realized that my as a bisexual / pansexual person, my attraction to male individuals tends to fall very heavily on the side of androgynous and more feminine leaning male people. And I think that had a huge amount to do with Jareth, and also just with David Bowie more generally. But also the character of Sarah in Labyrinth. I mean, she was beautiful. She was too young in the movie to really put, the full weight of sexual attraction on her, but she was beautiful and so spirited and independent and powerful. And I think that may have been one of the first films that I saw where a young woman was allowed to be the romantic lead, but in the end, she didn't have to fall in love to win. And that independence just, it really did something for me when I was young. And I think as I got older, I was introduced to Rocky Horror, and the rest is history. Much like you said, Michael, I went on, I seriously identified with Columbia as a young woman with red hair who really liked sparkles. And I loved the idea of living in this villainous or not, depending on your take on it, sort of community where sexuality was a part of everyone's identity. And it was open and it was valid and everybody was kind of into everybody else. And to me, that was like freedom itself. So in college, I tried out for the part of Columbia and was instead cast as Janet, which was probably like the biggest theater moment of my life, was getting to play Janet and slut it up on stage with everybody. It was fantastic.
That's so fabulous. An old friend usually phrases most people's queer awakening moment as when they ask themselves of someone on screen, do I want to be them? Do I want to be with them? Or do I just want their clothes? And I feel like that summarizes a lot of people's experience with Labyrinth. Oh my God, that's so insightful about the fact that Sarah doesn't have to fall in love to win. That genius. Gretchen.
So I'll start with Star Trek, because why not? It's 4 out of 5, can't be wrong. So again, I grew up from the time I was very little watching the original series, and I loved Spock. I don't think I necessarily identified with him as much as I was fascinated by being kind of the outsider and needing to understand the humans on the ship in order to be able to function with them and figure out his place with them. And then later with TNG, I felt the same way about Data. And it wasn't until many years later that I thought, okay, I always felt a little bit separate. So I always felt like I was watching rather than participating in a lot of things in a way that Spock and Data were often doing, so that they could emulate or not, or figure out where they needed to fit in that way. And I think that when I was very young, before I maybe realized my own queerness, that was part of what I was doing there. More than individual characters, I have always been drawn to the relationships between characters, and that's where I think I see myself more than in individual people. So like, for example, I love Spock, but without Kirk there, he loses something. And without Spock, Kirk loses a lot of interest for me personally. But these moments where Spock was, repressing emotion, very logical, but then something's going to happen to Kirk and he immediately yells Jim and jumps in front of him. Like those kinds of things where it was romantic or platonic, or it was just a strong feeling of comfort and acceptance and love. Those are the things that I really was drawn to growing up. And then when I got into the mid 90s, where I was realizing, because I also realized fairly young that I was queer, I started watching a lot of shows where there were 2 male leads who were pretty much opposite of each other. So things like The Sentinel and Due South back then. I was watching these things and I did not know things like shipping or slash existed yet, because this was kind of pre-internet for general entertainment times. And I was sitting there, I was like, man, they should be a couple. That would be great. Not realizing that all over the internet and in people's basements, people are printing zines about this very thing. I had completely forgotten about Rocky Horror until Lindsay mentioned it, which, geez, that's a big oversight. I remember I was in a video store with my dad when I was 12, and we're looking at videos, and I stopped and looked at Rocky Horror, and my dad's like, oh, it's a great movie. And I was like, I've never seen it. And my dad looks at me like I am nuts and is like, you've never seen Rocky Horror? I'm 12. So he rents it. We go home and watch it. And I was like, I don't get it. And then I re-rented it at 14 and I was like, oh, I get it now. So that 2 years of development turned this into, this is a strange thing I don't get, to I'm going to dress up like this all through high school and sing these songs. So.
Wow, I cannot imagine either of my parents ever having even known it existed. That is amazing. That is remarkable. So my next question is kind of related, and it's possible that it could be read as the same question, but I intended to be different, which is that a lot of queer stories are found in subtext. You know, whether or not the author or the creator intended it, a lot of times we see queerness in stories as a subtext that is like not exactly explicitly on display. So what's a story that you can recall encountering and thinking, oh, this is about me specifically, but either they don't know that when they wrote it, or they didn't want anybody else to know that, but they wanted me to be able to see myself in it. And again, I'll go first to try to give a sense of what I'm going for with that, which is, for me, it was Interview with the Vampire, which is possibly a really stereotyped answer for the average queer guy who likes horror. I don't know. But that sense of like they were marginalized and they more or less just wanted to be left alone to enjoy themselves in the way that they preferred. And they feel compelled to hide from a world that has made like no bones about the fact that it will happily hunt them down and exterminate them. And they're constantly told that they're dangerous. And in fact, their assumption that their status makes them dangerous sort of forces them to become dangerous people. There's an article that I'll talk about later, possibly, that in which the person that was writing about it was they described themselves as a villain-coded queer person because they had like really decided to lean in on that. And they said that for them, the realization was when someone said to them, your very existence is making other people feel unsafe. And there was something about that in Interview with the Vampire that it was like, oh, Anne Rice is talking to me. She's hoping that other people can hear this too and not catch that she's talking to me. But kind of in a way, she's talking to me. And for me, in that sense, vampires and their bloodlust was as much about queer rage as it was about queer sexuality. You know, for me, it was very much a story of people who are angry about the fact that the world won't accept them, and eventually it just becomes time to chop everybody's heads off. So that's kind of like the sort of thing that I'm talking about, where we saw ourselves in the story and we realized, oh, this was made for me, but maybe not everybody else realizes that. And this time I'm going to go reverse. So Gretchen.
Versus, I'm not sure I have a great answer for that. The first thing that comes to mind is Mulan, the Disney movie. Because in that and watching that, I was like, okay, there is this budding romance between this, young woman who is dressing as a man, despite the fact that, we have no indication that she's trans or has any sort of gender identity other than female. And this very macho, masculine soldier. And in the end, when she's revealed, like, you can kind of see the soldier go, oh, that's why I felt that way. Okay, I'm into this. And the idea that there was this gender play in there, and that her gender, her presentation of gender flopping from one to the other, her even being the kind of person that would present their gender as something other than what they were assigned at birth. I really loved that as a kid. And I was like, I don't think other people see this way or read this way, right? They're like, oh, Mulan gets to take off her pants and be a girl again and everything is saved. But I was like, no, she can put on pants again and she can go out and fight with her soldier and still get married and still have, whatever dream that she wants. And this is great because he is not frightened by the fact that she has this sort of gender play going on.
I love that as an answer. Lindsay, how about you?
Yeah, this is a tough question. But I'm kind of going through the things that I loved growing up and kind of finding that each of them kind of fits this. but I think probably one of the earliest ones is Sleeping Beauty for me. I became obsessed with the movie Sleeping Beauty when I was pretty young because I desperately wanted to be Maleficent. Um, and there's absolutely nothing in Sleeping Beauty that's anything but heterosexual. Well, with the exception maybe of the three fairies who live together, but they're older and not really presented. I don't really know. But they're not who I'm talking about. Maleficent, to me, was this powerful, powerful female entity who obviously extremely evil also, but she was so beautiful. And to me, it felt like this character couldn't possibly be this gorgeous, not on purpose. I'm not sure if that makes sense. But her independence, her complete and utter contempt for the male characters in the story, the prince, the kings, she was very clearly doing something on her own. She didn't need anyone except maybe the Raven character that she carried around with her on her staff. And she had her minions, but they were totally useless. Everything that she did on her own. And something about that it spoke very clearly to me. And it wasn't until much, much later that I started kind of examining why that might have been. And I still love that movie, although at this point I watch it and I'm cringing constantly at the sort of the heteropatriarchy that shows its hand in the original story and in the Disney presentation of it, but it's still one of my favorite things because I feel so at home in it. So I think that's probably number one. And number two, I would say, is Frankenstein, the book. I read that going into my undergraduate studies, and then over the course of my undergraduate education, I reread it probably 5 times. I wrote several papers on it, and I've been obsessed with it ever since. And I just reread it again. I listened to it in audiobook form, and I suddenly was like, oh my God, Victor and Henry are so gay. They are so gay for each other. How did I not pick up on this before? Because I had always been reading it much more from like a feminist text or feminist perspective. And I wrote a very long paper about how it's a feminist text. And I really hadn't been focusing on the relationship between those two men. But it's the kind of thing that once I noticed it, I'm like, well, it's been there all along. And that was clearly part of what was speaking to me about the complicatedness of the character of Victor Frankenstein in the first place. So those are my 2 big ones, I think.
Great, thank you. Wow, now I need to reread Frankenstein.
Mm-hmm.
Tracy.
Okay, well, one thing, every time like the queer-coded villains comes up, that always resonates with me because as a kid, I was in all the different cartoons and stuff, I was always drawn to the villains. And, like even like I have a brother who's close to my age. And so when we'd like collect the toys, he'd get all the good guys and I'd get all the bad guys. And at the time I told it's like, oh, well, their stuff's just cooler. But, kind of looking back, I think there's a lot more to it. I mean, they were the outsiders. They were challenging the status quo. Often they were very blatantly doing problematic things, but apart from that, there were certain elements that I related to of feeling different and not fitting in. I also think of 3PO because C-3PO, and I don't know much about Anthony Daniels, the person inside the suit, but it definitely comes across queer-coded in certain ways, and that for me, and also being nerdy, those of you who know me, I'm a math guy by day. I can tell you the odds. I do recognize that most people don't want to hear them, but so there's definitely some to emulate with there as well.
Natanya.
Okay, there we go. Sorry, my unmute was not unmuting. Now it's unmuting. I think mine's a little sadder just because I really grew up in very male-dominated fantasy worlds just because that's what I loved. And I certainly didn't see much of myself. I mean, I can certainly talk about Wrinkle in Time and having Meg as a character, it was really the first time I ever read and even considered that a girl could really do any of these things, but I don't really think her story is particularly, I mean, in some ways, I think she's definitely a good neurodiverse character and other things, and the otherness is certainly there, but I don't think it registered. I think the saddest of all of them is getting to the end of the Chronicles of Narnia and having always identified with Susan, who was like, you know, she kind of had masculine tendencies. She was an awesome archer. She didn't just have magical healing powers, but turns out she liked lipstick and pantyhose, and she's just going to go to hell at the end. So I remember just this ultimate feeling of total betrayal, like, because I love those things too. I've always been, you know, both feminine presenting, but also having moments where I just want to pick up a sword and knock someone's head off. And that was just extremely heartbreaking for me. I mean, I just remember getting to that part. I'm like, can I just go back to when this wasn't a thing in the books and we can just pretend this didn't happen? Because that was an incredibly conservative, very broken way of looking at character development. There's a million things I could say about it that were just very formative and making me feel like I didn't belong here. And then I think in terms of my own fandoms, I was, you know, really embedded in Lord of the Rings fandom, especially when the movies first came out. You know, I was really involved in online mushes and all the kind of internet phenomenon that it was back then, which is kind of, it's forever ago now, but it was pretty amazing to have this fandom really explode online. And both, I think for me, Éowyn was always hugely identified to me. I would never, ever, ever say that Tolkien had any queer thoughts whatsoever, because he was about the most curmudgeonly old patriarchal man in the universe. It is like, there's so few women that even have any agency. They had to make it better in the movies. But I did love that she was a person of two worlds. I think duality always really spoke a lot to me as a bisexual person. But I mean, like Lindsay said, I have a broader understanding of that now, but it was always like, I felt like there was, you know, conflicting worlds within me, and seeing boys my age getting paid more attention to when they were saying the same words that I was. And that was very much all of Éowyn's life, was like, literally, I just said exactly what my brother said and everyone ignored me. So you know what? Screw that. I'm going to grab a hobbit. I'm going to get on with a horse and I'm going to kill a Nazgul. You know, and that kind of attitude was really, really amazing. But I also think the portrayal, like we were saying, kind of like the clothing and the androgyny in the films of the elves. I mean, there really isn't that much of a difference between the male and female, and even, I mean, one would even argue that there is just sort of an androgyny that was presented in the films, and I found that very powerful. This sort of cold beauty that existed in this amazing group of people, and I thought that was kind of a nicer way to go about elves and dwarves too. We could talk forever about dwarves. There were even some dwarves with beards on them, some women in the Hobbit films, which I thought was pretty cool, because there were some interesting things that occasionally Tolkien did, but not usually. He probably would have argued that he didn't mean to do it later. But yeah, it didn't really come later till I actually felt like I saw myself. It was always really grasping at straws or identifying with male characters. I think I loved Merry and Pippin to death, and that you know, they were sort of this hectic, you know, joyful, accident-prone semi-heroes, and I loved that. But yeah, that's kind of where I am. Mostly disappointment.
That's very understandable. You know, Tracy, you brought up queer-coded villains and like seeing a lot of queerness in that. And one of the things that the library wanted us to talk about is problematic representations. You know, that's just one of the topics we can't ignore when we talk about finding ourselves in queer fandom. So like, how do we deal with that? Do we fix them by like rewriting them in fanfic? Do we reinscribe the ones we have? Apparently, I have not read any of this, but apparently there are a bunch of points in various writers' takes on Batman that suggest that maybe Batman is as into the Joker as he is Catwoman, which I find an interesting way to take a very dapper villain who is kind of effete and effeminate and queer-coded a little bit and turn that story inside out. Do we write our own and try to drown that stuff out? Like, do we embrace it and look the other way? I don't think there's a wrong answer to this question. I'm not even totally sure what my own answer to this question would be. It's just that, like, we can't ignore that that's there. And so I guess maybe this is my question. What's a problematic moment of representation that you love anyway? And in that sense, I'm going to then talk about the thing that I said earlier I might mention. There's a great Medium article. I'll provide a link so that it can pop up on the screen here, hopefully, fingers crossed. And it's called I'm a Villain Coded Queer. And it's by a writer who describes the fact that they saw power in villains who were queer coded. Much like you said, Tracy, they're people who are outsiders, and they have also decided they're going to pursue what they want. They don't care that what they want is outside the mainstream. And there were two quotes from that article that I really loved. And one of them was, "We want to be scary. We want to put people off. We are done seeking mainstream approval." Which really, like when I read that, I got goosebumps because it really spoke to me and how I saw those characters. But also, your very existence is making other people feel unsafe. The quote that I mentioned when I was talking about Interview with the Vampire. So I guess maybe my problematic representation that I love anyway is Interview with the Vampire, and I've already talked enough about that. So I'm going to jump in with Lindsay first.
Ooh, this is a good one. I think I'm flashing back to Rocky Horror for this. Because I mean, obviously, from one perspective, Dr. Frankenfurter is the villain. But then obviously, from a different perspective, so is Janet. And obviously, so is Dr. Scott. I mean, everybody in Rocky Horror is not a great person. Most of them are very problematic. And, you know, Dr. Frankenfurter being kind of the central character and the one with sort of the most agency throughout, he's also the villain. But he's also acting from a place of having been othered and hurt on his own planet, which is why he came to Earth, to try to establish, you know, this queer, sex-positive utopia. But he apparently landed in the 1960s or 70s when that wasn't an okay thing to do. So from the way I read it, he tried to establish this sex-positive utopia, and it didn't work out so well. So he started kind of kidnapping people and experimenting on their brains, you know, like you do. But I think that for me, sort of the larger question about what do we do with these problematic representations of queer characters, and especially villains, is I enjoy the process of psychoanalyzing the villain. I actually would argue that like the last 10 years or so of major pop culture has largely been psychoanalyzing villains. You know, we've gotten much more into the anti-hero trope, and like thinking of Breaking Bad. I mean, that was a massive cultural phenomenon, and it was all getting into the head of this guy who starts out as the hero and ends up as the villain. I think it's sort of a fascination for us right now, culturally speaking. And I've always enjoyed that process. And I think that the past 10 years of pop culture have made me get more into psychoanalyzing the villains. And I think that a lot of the time when those villains are queer coded, you know, if you really spend some time with the character and think about where they're coming from, a lot of it is, like you said, Michael, queer rage. You know, growing up, being othered, being marginalized, being silenced, and repressing who you truly are can lead to a lot of rage. And I think that for a lot of the characters that we grew up with, you know, that's where they're coming from. Sure, they maybe made some very poor decisions and maybe should have gotten some more therapy before they became supervillains, but that's not always an option for everybody. And sometimes you end up, you know, leaving your home planet and turning everybody into your sex slave, like Dr. Frankenfurter. It's not the best decision, but it's valid in its own way.
It's definitely like, it's an unusual take on how to conduct one's life, and it speaks to his priorities. I love psychoanalyzing the villains. Tracy, what about you? What do you do when you encounter a problematic representation?
You know, that can be a tough one. I mean, it partly depends on the time frame. Because one example I think of, and I was having a discourse with a friend about this on Facebook recently. So, you know, they recently announced that Discovery in their new upcoming season is going to have both a trans and a non-binary character. And, you know, the headline says, you know, the first for Star Trek, which, and then you've got all this chorus of the well, actually people who are primarily, you know, some of them go to Dax, but a lot of them are pointing to a Next Generation episode called The Outcast. And, you know, I think this episode was pretty progressive for its time, for around 1990. In today's lens, it's very regressive, because basically had a planet of people that were androgynous, only had one gender, and apparently they hadn't always been that way. But so one of the characters that, of course, has been working closely with Riker decides that that they're actually female, rather than, you know, not having a gender. And, you know, it leads to some problems and stuff. And I think originally it was meant as an allegory for like being gay. And in that way it was progressive, but they didn't think at all in 1990 about trans people and non-binary people, and how this episode represents them very poorly. And so, you know, but that episode, I try to look at it in the context of its time and not, you know, write it off completely based on today's lens. And, you know, I think a lot about that in terms of queer coded characters and subtext in general. You know, like something that has come out in the last few years. There's no reason for queer coding. There's no reason for subtext. It just needs to be out there. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, you know, if it wasn't subtext, it wouldn't have been there. And so, I try to look at the context of time, in part judging.
Yeah, I think that it's these days. I think you're right. There is absolutely no reason for subtext, and it's sort of. I'm going to just go ahead and be judgmental and say it's kind of cowardly when creators lean on subtext these days, because they could just put it on the page. Natanya, what about you? What do you do with problematic representations?
Yeah, I'm echoing a little bit of what Lindsay and Tracy both said, is that there's been a lot of change very quickly in the last 5 to 10 years. And the first one that always comes to mind about the worst to me is in Outlander. And I loved Outlander when it came out, but the villain is not only pretty much the only queer person, but his queerness is a function of his villainy. And that's just inexcusable to me. Yes, there can be queer villains, and their queerness can be a method of hurt or torture. You can do that, but when it's literally the only person who is queer presenting, that is not okay. And that kind of majorly turned me off to that series. I hoped in the show that they would kind of, and I think they toned it down a little bit, but it still just does not have that depth of trueness to me that is required. It's very much kind of the opposite of almost what you see with the post publication of Harry Potter and the like, oh, by the way, Dumbledore is gay. We just didn't want to go ahead and say it because that might have been, oh, I don't know, hugely meaningful to millions of children who felt ostracized and had to figure out like which character was maybe secretly gay. Not to go in that department, because we could talk a whole other series about Harry Potter and queer coded characters. But it's a similar thing to that. I think a lot about mainstream, because having 2 kids myself, that's where they're getting most of this stuff. And there's a lot that's kind of in subcultures, and certainly a lot more books out there, big series, but it takes a while for that to kind of permeate the big time. I think Marvel, Loki is someone that I always identified with just because he's fabulous. I think he was done a major disservice in the series ultimately, and I know that they set him up for his own series and everything, but it's almost like once he kind of had this really interesting redemption arc, then he was just systematically destroyed, which is such a thing that happens with queer characters anyway. It's like, oh, you finally you like your brother now, you've made reparations, like you're no longer a practical Nazi. That's awesome. Now we're going to just murder you in like 3 seconds, this like major character. And then you have oh, by the way, Valkyrie, you could be a king or a queen at the end. And it's like, that's just such a disappointment for me, especially superheroes have such an amazing area to talk about queerness and otherness, and it's getting there, but it's such baby steps that it's almost like, I don't want to say it's not worth it, because it is important for people to hear that. And it's so much more than what I saw when I was young, but it still feels like such a throwaway when we know how much the population is here and how much the population is so, like you said, loving the subtext and really absorbing this and identifying with this. I mean, I have a Loki sticker on my car, you know, it's like, there is just something that made sense to me about this, you know, irascible trickster character who in the canon is as queer as you could possibly get. Like, I mean, seriously. But it's just a shame that we're still so hesitant to make those steps. And we're still just seeing, you know, the lesbians dying in the second series or the second episode of their first character arcs. I mean, it's just, it's so pervasive. It just sends this terrible message that queerness is expendable. And I think that really bothers me, that like queerness is a method to move the plot forward for straight characters to feel empathy, very much in the same way we talk about disability. Like if characters' disability is the way for the main characters to feel better and become a better person. And that's not what we're here for. So I'm done.
That's an amazing point though. And Gretchen, what about you? What do you do with problematic representations?
So a couple of things. One of the ones that bothers me the most, that I'm most likely to like yell at the TV or toss the book across the room for a few minutes, is bi erasure, which we see a lot of. And when I went and saw the movie Bohemian Rhapsody, I cackled hysterically because the entire conversation was Freddie Mercury saying, "I'm bisexual," his girlfriend saying, "You're gay, Freddie," and then they never said anything about it again, which might actually be the most realistic way bisexuality gets looked at. So I was like, at least they were honest about it. But, you know, constantly characters that are in a relationship with someone of the opposite sex or in, you know, some sort of thing with someone of a different gender, and then they go into a queer relationship or vice versa, and all of a sudden they are a sexual orientation binary. There's no conversation about the middle. And I would like to see more of that. And I think that we lose a lot of people, because in my day job, I work with statistics, and one of the things I do is measure sexual orientation. And there are far more people that identify as bisexual. Generally, if you give people the response options of straight, gay or lesbian, bisexual, there are about twice as many people that fall in that bisexual category as either lesbians or gay. So if you combine gays and lesbians together, you get about the same amount as bisexual people. And overwhelmingly, it's women that identify with being bisexual. And that's not to mention, as younger folks and our Gen Z folks grow into this question, we need to be expanding those categories to people which are also not the sexual orientation binaries. So I like that fandom tends to do more with that, with things that are not a binary, that are somewhere in the middle. We've also talked about queer-coded villains. I was someone that never really saw myself in a queer-coded villain. I was not particularly interested in villains a lot of the time. Where I did see myself is in the queer-coded sidekick, like C-3PO. And for me, as someone who consumes and writes romance, those characters never get their own story. So you don't get to see what their sexual orientation and what their life is actually like. They don't get a happy ending because they are just there generally in a humorous or quirky way to prop up the hero, right? So I feel bad when I see those queer-coded side characters, because the reinforcement is that you never get your own story from that. And that is another thing I would like to see more of. And I think that's something fandom does really well. Like if you pick any fandom and go into Archive of Our Own and search for not the hero, but like, for example, Pacific Rim, you look for those quirky side scientists, you're going to get a lot of fanfic. And I think that picking up on those side characters that don't get their own story is something that fandom does really well.
So that leads to a question I think could be really good to explore then. Like, what do we wish there were more of that we just don't get, and why? And I think, well, let me answer my own question from before I do that. The thing that I do with problematic representations is I ask myself, do I actually think they're problematic? It is possible that I am too forgiving when it comes to representation, because I grew up so starved for representation that I was willing to take like whatever I could get my hands on representation wise. But so I tend to ask a few questions about representation that I see as problematic. Does the queer character have any agency in the story? Or like Natanya said, are they purely a way for somebody else to advance their story? You know, were they a prop? Could they have been replaced with a particularly interesting piece of furniture? Then I ask myself, are there other queer representations in the story? So am I getting more than one queer perspective in the story? And then it's more or less like, were they killed off to make a point? You know, like, was their story cut short? Was their queerness used to say that all queer people are bad? Are they bad because of the queerness? Or is it just that they happen to be bad and queer, which I could be very into? And in that regard, I'll move to the next thing, which comes from what you were saying, Gretchen, which is, what do we want more of? I want more stories where there are so many queer characters that it's impossible to tie queerness to any particular character's place in the structure of the story. I want stories where all the protagonists and all the antagonists and everybody in town and every NPC villager who sells them food on the way is a queer character, so that that's just like completely separated from any sort of like moral value that might be attached to their role in a story. And so that anybody who reads it can find what they're looking for in the story in terms of a queer identity. If somebody says, I just want to know that there are fantasy worlds where it's possible to be the innkeeper and be queer and to have nobody shove a sword in your face and nobody like burns down your inn and the dragon doesn't stomp you flat, you just sell everybody another mug of beer and do it again tomorrow. I want people to be able to find that. And if they want to be the person who slays the dragon, great, I want them to find that. And if they want to be the dragon, great, I'm there with you. Oh, you know, you can have first ride, whatever. You know, like I want like that sort of richness of queer casts, so that then queer stories can be any kind of story and it's not attached to that kind of thing. So in that sense, like, what are you looking for more of when you go to fandom? What do you wish there were more of for queer characters? And I'll start with Tracy.
There's different things I look for. I mean, first and foremost, I want more authentic experiences, you know, and within the different identities, I want more diversity. So I want, you know, you have a few different, you know, within each identity, there's a few different more popular, more cliche presentations, you know, whether it be for gay men or trans women or non-binary people. You know, any group you pick, there's a small sliver of the actual people in that group represented. And so I want, you know, a more diverse range within each of those people, so each person can see themselves, you know, more clearly. I mean, like, you know, me personally, I'm a more masculine presenting, overweight gay man, and how many of those can you point to in a TV show or a book or a comic or a video game? I mean, and this is my experience, and I know there's a lot of other people that present very differently from me who also experience the same thing. Okay, so, you know, we technically have this bi character, but that bi character is nothing like me. You know, we have, or, you know, the person saying that. And so I want a wider range of authentic experiences.
What about you, Lindsay?
Well, while you were framing your question, Michael, I wanted to jump in and be like, can we talk about Steven Universe for a second? I think what I want in the world is more Steven Universe and more everything to be more like Steven Universe. I am so glad that I started watching that. You know, like I'm a little old for that fandom, I think. It was introduced to me by much younger people, but started watching it, and you know, not only are most of the very strong protagonists queer, they're sort of a variety of queernesses. There's the main thing for me is that there's also poly representation. And as someone who is polyamorous, it's just something that you don't see. You don't see it represented anywhere. And when you do, it's almost always this problematic, people are fighting, it's dramatic, or people are just trying to figure out how to be monogamous, although they clearly want to have more than one partner. And it is sometimes, the entire impetus for a book or a movie or, an arc of a TV show is figuring out who to be with, and the option that you can navigate that differently doesn't even exist. So when I was watching Steven Universe and I saw the dynamic developing between Pearl and Greg and Rose Quartz, my mind was completely blown. I actually had like a full-on crying breakdown. I called my ex-girlfriend and was like, I'm coming to see you because we have to talk about some things. And I literally got on a plane, went to New York, and talked to her about this revelation that I had through Steven Universe. And although obviously the triad there doesn't go particularly well, and ends unfortunately in Rose Quartz sort of dying, sort of becoming Steven, I just felt that the heartfeltness that they put into developing that relationship and showing how complicated it was and how much everyone cared about everyone else and was trying so hard to be their best. That's the kind of representation that the poly community has never had, anywhere else that I know of, hands down. And I also really loved that it was put into a show that is, for all intents and purposes, a kid's show. That Steven is this kid growing up who does not have a typical family structure. He is being raised by 3 women that are, collaboratively raising him. And sometimes they join forces and become one giant woman and one smaller woman. And sometimes they're one huge woman, I love the way that different orientations and different relationships are given so much space and so much dignity in Steven Universe. So I would say for anyone who wants to create anything with queer representation or poly representation moving forward, just sit down and watch all of Steven Universe.
So awesome. Natanya, what do you want to see more of?
Sure, I would echo. I think my favorite Rebecca Sugar quote is actually, they said, someone asked, like, what was your point of doing Steven Universe? And they said, I just wanted innocent queer love to be something that kids could understand, because it is so often grossly over-sexualized and turned into so much more than, you just aren't allowed to have this Twitter-pated, I have a crush on you kind of thing, and that built from there, and it certainly became far more complex. But I just love that they said that it was really this, because my kids ate it up, and Shira, I could go on a whole thing about Shira too. My son absolutely has watched every episode, will not stop talking about it. It changed his life. I think personally what I would love to see more of, I decided about 1.5 years ago to really try to read more light stuff, because I was reading so much difficult stuff that I was sort of losing my mind because the world was so difficult. So I started reading a lot of YA and kind of stumbling into fae romance and all of that kind of stuff. And I just cannot believe for the life of me that fae people aren't all just queer. Like, when I read an entire series and all the men are just super manly men, but they all have flowing long hair and they all wear beautiful coordinated outfits and they all have chiselly but also feminine characteristics, it is so hard for me to believe they're not also banging each other. I just can't. And I know Archive of Your Own, I'm mostly talking about Sarah J. Maas's books, which I've read all of and just consumed, and it was a combination of ugh and yes the whole time, but so much of that was, and just really bad coming out stories as well. But to me, the fae is like the most obvious queer analogy in the universe, right? Literally words like effeminate and then fae, and these all are related to each other. So it's absolutely bizarre. But a really good example, I think, is Leigh Bardugo, even not fae books, but certainly in YA. She's presented, especially Six of Crows in her series, characters that range in their queerness, and a bisexual character who, even though is separated from her, you know, straight relationship for a while, still totally crushes on girls and is not going, oh God, how am I going to ever, you know, honor my past relationship that was with a dude because now I'm attracted to this girl. No, she's like, this girl is super hot and I love her hair and I want to touch it and braid it and kiss her face. And I just love that that wasn't even an issue. And I think that was that character was the most identifiable for me. And I love that it's happening in YA. I think it's really important that it's happening in YA. It's just not really happening, I don't think, unfortunately, outside of romance, which is wonderful that it's happening in romance, but it also needs to happen in good storytelling. I just finished both Gideon the Ninth and Harrow the Ninth, which, stop what you're doing. If you haven't read them, go read them. We can talk about that later, but there really haven't been a whole lot that have really resonated to that level where queerness is just a thing, but it's really important, but it's not, like you're saying, Michael, it happens to be what these people are. And it's awesome and it's amazing and it's complicated, but it's beautiful. And it's not, yeah, we just kind of deserve that too.
Totally. I was on a panel at a different online con a few months ago where I said that one of my biggest complaints about the publishing industry is that basically mainstream publishing will every June produce one book that is a queer book in some way. Everybody probably dies before the end of it. And then they'll say, let's fire the confetti cannons, it's Pride Month. Tomorrow we're going to publish 300 more completely cishet love triangle YA novels that in no way acknowledge the queerness that is possible between the two members of that triangle who may or may not have the same gender identity. But anyway, Gertie, what about you?
So what I want more of and what I turn to fandom to find more of tends to be things that are not commercially viable. Like you're saying, like we get one queer book a year and whatever. And that used to be a lot of just queer relationships and queer topics, and that is changing. We are getting more of that, both mainstream and really the internet and ebook publishing allowed this burst of things that didn't have to, you know, sell 1 million copies to be considered commercially viable. You could cover costs in a much less strenuous way, and you got more diverse voices that way. But what I think doesn't make a good commercial story is something that doesn't have conflict and doesn't have angst. But that's what I want sometimes. The world is hard, as Tanya said, right? So I can go on AO3 and read 1,000 coffee shop AUs where it's just about sweet falling in love and that's it. Also, the other thing is that a lot of the commercial stories, you see the beginning of a relationship and then it's over. You don't see 10 years in, there's not really anything terribly bad, but maybe it's a little stressful, like low angst kind of stuff. And sometimes I just want to check in on those characters and see, you know, what they're doing 10, 15, 20 years into this relationship that's still good when there's not some sort of like catastrophic event occurring that makes them suddenly relevant to a more commercialized story. So that's what I tend to go to fandom for, because I know that I'm not going to be able, at least right now, to buy a book that has that kind of storyline. Other things, and this might be controversial, so I'm gonna say it kind of backwards. Something I want more of is creators I can trust to do these kinds of storylines, because there's part of me, like, you know, that coming of age in the early to mid 90s sort of thing with my queerness. I miss subtext sometimes, because there are a lot of creators that I'm like, please don't do this because I don't think you're going to do it well. I would rather you leave it as subtext and then me go on the internet and find people who know what's really going on that will do it 10 times better. I'm talking to you, Stephen Moffat. I really wanted Sherlock and John together, but I'm so glad you didn't do it because you would have done it terribly. So in a way, like I don't necessarily want more subtext, but I want subtext to stick around in certain situations until I have enough creators I trust to do that. And Michael, your point about more queer people in a cast, like every time I see shows or books where there's one queer person, I'm like, this is totally unrealistic. We group together. We don't hang out with straight people. This is crazy. Like, even before we know we're queer, like, full disclosure, Lindsay and I have known each other for 30 years, have been best friends since we were 7. Our group of like type 5 girlfriends post high school, 4 out of the 5 of us are queer. We didn't know that at the time, but we found each other because we knew. So even like before your characters are coming out, there's not one queer person hanging out with a bunch of straight people. It doesn't happen that way.
In 1992, I graduated from high school with in a class of 240 people from rural, like deep in the holler, Appalachian, Western North Carolina. And within a year, and I went to college elsewhere, so I had limited time back in that place. But within a year, I had seen 37 people from my graduating class at the gay bar in Asheville. And you're right, like we cluster. That's just the way it is. So we only have a few minutes left, but 4 of us are writers and creators. Tracy is an expert on critiquing comics. Tell us about the stories that you write and what makes them queer, and especially what it is that you want other people, particularly queer people maybe, to find in those stories. Like, what is it? What's the queerness that you're putting into those stories for them to find? And in Tracy's case, I'd really love for you to tell us about a comic that you wish more people knew about. And so, again, I'll go first because it's unfair to ask complicated questions and then make somebody just be like on the spot about them. I write horror, urban fantasy, and science fiction. Everything that I write has queer characters. Almost all of it is told first person from a queer character's perspective. And usually what I want other people to find is the experience of feeling like they are perpetually on the outside looking in, and then finding their people in the course of that. You know, I was somebody who, it felt like it took me a long time to find my people. And that experience eventually was really good for me. And so I want people reading those stories to recognize that experience of feeling like they don't belong or they haven't found their people yet, and then they do find that found family. Everything I write is ultimately about found family in that sense. You know, and I have a horror series about a guy who became a vampire in the 1940s because he was queer and he had been told that that made him a monster, and he decided he would show the world what a monster was. And then in the 2010s, he makes friends for the first time, you know, and he has people to go hang out with and people to invite over. And that sort of stuff is really precious and valuable. But like you said, Gretchen, it's not high drama. And so like the novel has all this like high drama stuff, but the entire time I was writing the series, what I was just desperate to get to was the last scene of just him hanging out on his back porch with a friend, and like the world is saved, and now he can just like have a life for the first time in decades, many decades, maybe a century of being alive. And so that's the kind of stuff I try to put in my stories, to try to speak to queer readers and to talk a little about my version of the many infinite varieties of queer experiences that there are. Lindsay, tell us about your stories and what you create and the queerness in them.
Well, I've been in the process of writing a few new things recently, but none of them are available yet, so I don't know how much to talk about them. For a long time, I wrote primarily nonfiction as a journalist, and I wrote a memoir about myself, so it's been a while since I've really been in the fiction writing brain space. But now that I have started writing more fiction again, I've realized that all of my main characters just are queer. It's often not a huge factor in who they are or in their development or in the story itself. But when I really start digging into any character that I want to write about, I usually discover that they're queer in some way. And then that sort of reverberates through, you know, their story and their experience of the world. So the things I'm working on now, they're all queer. The story that I think I should talk about most here, without getting too far into it because it is adult in nature, is Tracy Queen, which is an ongoing graphic novel that I'm publishing serially. So right now 2 issues are out. There are 6 more to come. It's written by me, illustrated by J.L. Draco, and we're putting it out through Aneshi Press. And Tracy Queen is a person who starts out as a villain. She was raised in a life of crime, and basically realizes in her mid-20s that she doesn't want to do this anymore. She's tired of violence, and instead she chooses a life of pleasure and starts doing adult webcamming. And when she does that, this sort of whole new world of ideas about how you can be as a person opens up to her, and soon she starts filming content with other people, and soon that turns into filming with different types of people, and she actually discovers her own queerness through the act of sex work. And there's a whole lot of other really wild, over-the-top stuff in it because it's a graphic novel, and you can do whatever the hell you want in a graphic novel. So there's a whole lot of sci-fi, there's some cyborg clones, there's a porn star army that she has to go up against, there's a talking raccoon. It's got everything. And it's a slow build, however, to Tracy sort of reaching her final form, where she realizes her own identification is vastly different than what she always assumed it to be, because the way that she was raised and the world that she grew up in didn't provide her with any representation of people not just being straight. And that really reflects my own experience. I think that little me from a very young age knew that there was something going on there, but I really didn't even get to the point where I felt like I should put a name on it until I was well into my adult years. So Tracy's story is really a reflection of that.
I have to read that immediately.
Right.
Let's go with another Tracy for the answer. Tracy, tell us about something.
Okay, well, first of all, Lindsay, let me say, I'd never heard of Oneshi Press. I'm very interested to check out some of your stuff, and it sounds awesome. As far as things, that I wish people knew more about, I think especially there's some more known independent people that I think of, like the Kim and Kim series from Magdalene Visaggio. It's just great representation of these two women that are kind of like bounty hunters, but and one of them is trans with a very, she's not overly feminine. She's got like this punk rock kind of goth aesthetic, and the way the relationships and stuff are presented is just fantastic. But even going smaller than that, I want people, to know more about smaller indie artists. Like I think of a couple of books. One of them is one that I backed on Kickstarter, and I don't know how widely published it is. It's called "We Have to Go Back" by Jordan Alsaka, and this story is it's this story about two women in this kind of post-apocalyptic setting where they have went off to this cabin in the mountains, and the story is just so real and so touching. And I wish there were more stuff like this, more mainstream, and so I want stories like this to get out there. Another one I think of is called Strange Lore, and I'm having trouble remembering the name of the writer and artist offhand, but it's like it's a bit of a super powered person story, but it's also this gay romance in a small town and in the South, and it hit some notes for me. And both of these I've talked about in podcast episodes, so if you go through our back catalog, you'll hit some of them.
That's awesome. Gretchen, what about you?
So kind of recurrent themes I have seen in my work that come out. Found families, again, is a big thing. And kind of adjacent to found families, finding a place in the community as well, which isn't necessarily always the same as found families. And I have the first two books out in a series that is contemporary male-male romance, where it's based around a hookup app and how this app leads people who are maybe not in the queer community, which tends to be very cisgendered, white, gay man, under 35 in a bar kind of thing, how this leads them to finding each other, and how relationships come out of something that is not necessarily intended to build relationships. So there are a couple of books out in that at this point, and I have more planned for that one. And I think part of that does come from being a bisexual woman, where, especially a bisexual woman with a male, cisgendered male long-term partner, like I go to Pride, I know people think I'm straight. Like, okay, fine. But that idea of finding place in the community, especially when maybe the community isn't built for you, exactly, or the community that gets presented isn't built for you exactly. So that's one. The other one is kind of low angst, happy ending, slow burn kind of stuff. I do historical lesbian romance as well, in part because it's kind of easy to do historical lesbian romance. But the way it's easy also takes a lot of the conflict out of it, because so much of historical gay romance for men is that this is a thing that was not allowed and it's very obvious and you're going to get in trouble. I mean, spinsters live together all the time. Nobody blinked an eye at it, right? So kind of finding a story in there tends to be something that is very introspective and slow and focused on character growth. So that's another kind of theme that I tend to write, is how women sort of slid under the radar into these relationships that then were discounted publicly, and what that might have meant to them privately.
So true. Natanya, tell us about your work.
Sure. So this one over here, These Marvelous Beasts, is 3 novellas, and all the main characters are queer in some aspect or another, but it's 100% about found families. It's also about romance. I love unrequited love. And so 2 of the main characters, one absolutely loves the other woman, and it's just not going to happen because sometimes you just don't fall in love with that person. But both of them have love stories that are queer stories that happen later. And I really wanted to play with that trope of like, oh, you're both lesbians? Well, here, you guys can date each other because that's perfect, right? But it's much more relationship based. All the characters, the whole series is really about the interplay of the people together. Like there's an ex who ends up with somebody else. And like Gertie was saying earlier, it's about where you put the lens on the story, because a romance is not, I don't like books that culminate in a relationship. To me, that's not a story. That's just a plot point. And so I really wanted to play with this idea that these characters live for hundreds of years. So they, of course, they know people that they were in relationships before, and they had storied difficulties, and someone's not over somebody. And it's so much more complicated than it looks on paper. So it's much more fun and kind of, it's definitely witty and rollicking. It's not as serious, but they're all monsters too. So you get to have the supernatural element. And then I think my other stories definitely fall into the self-discovery category. So my first novel up here, Pilgrim of the Sky, is very much about the main character who's bi and pretty open about it in the series, really discovering who she is and finding a found family. But there's a lot of responsibility in that, because she finds out she's ultimately a very powerful person and has, abilities that are beyond just this, and her queerness is definitely a part of that and part of her understanding that. The sequel to that will be out next year as well, which is another character who's gay. Well, I guess he's whatever he feels like on a given day. I mean, sometimes it's no label, but the main romance in that is a male-male relationship, and that's the most powerful romance story that I've ever written. And it's not terribly lustful, and it's not terribly necessarily even that sexy. It really is about the connection of people that is super profound. And I love writing stories like that, when people just find each other and it's like they make each other glow in a way, but the world around them can't support that, and that sort of tragedy of that. And then my book coming out in December is Queen of None, and on first glance it doesn't seem like it's a queer story, but it definitely is. I can't give away too much of it, but one of the things again is I wanted sort of the structure of, it's in Arthuriana, so it's in Camelot. Arthur himself is gay, and it's normally not a big deal, except when you're the king, you're kind of expected to have an heir and kind of make things look a certain way. So there's that conflict, and the sister of Arthur is the main character. And she as well, if you kind of look at what she's looking at, she's constantly commenting on ladies and how they look and their outfits. And then she makes some very strategic decisions later on, but she's also, the book starts with her in her 30s with grown-up children and a widow rather. And I really wanted to have a woman who was still in charge of her sexuality, who still felt herself desirable and would want to, hook up with dudes and if other things as well, but also not have it be this like figured out thing for her. I think it's important that we still have stories where people are not getting all the answers at the end and their queerness is not completely resolved. And so that was kind of interesting to look back on that, because I wrote the first draft of that about 10 years ago, but in subsequent revisions, it really became clear that there's a lot of queerness that's being looked at. And certainly one can also have another panel about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table and queerness, because that's certainly fertile ground for that too. But yeah, that's kind of the big themes there.
Thanks. So we'll just go around one more time real quick and say where people can find us. thank you everybody for being here. Thank you to the Billings, Montana Public Library and Con-Tinual, and thanks to everybody who watched this panel or watches it in the future, because time is weird in this moment. I'm Michael G. Williams. You can find me at www.michaelgwilliamsbooks.com, and there are links to everything else that's mine from there. Natanya, where can we find you?
Sure. So I make it pretty easy. I'm natanyabaron.com. I'm at Natanya Baron on Twitter and Instagram. I'm at Natanya Books on TikTok, where I've been giving writing advice. And you can find most of my books in both indie and straight mainstream kind of places if you'd like to look for them. My new book, Queen of None, is coming out in December, and Kirkus liked it, so I got to throw that in there.
Yes, you do. That's amazing. Congratulations.
I'm still not sure that actually happened, but you know.
It definitely has happened. Tracy, where can people find you?
Well, in particular, the podcast, you can find us at diversityissues.libsyn.com. We're also available if you search Diversity Issue Podcasts on most podcast places. We're there, including like Apple, like iTunes and Spotify. You can also find us on Twitter and Facebook, Instagram. You can also look for me personally. I'm just under Tracy Holt. I live in Durham, North Carolina, if that helps you find me. Oh, yeah.
Awesome. Lindsay, where can folks find you?
The easiest way to find all the places that I am is via my website. It's lyndseyg.com, and I'm going to spell it because my name is spelled weirdly. It's LYNSEYG.com. And all of my publishing life happens at oneshipress.com. I'm going to spell that again because it's a word that we made up and nobody knows how to spell it. It's ONESHIPRESS.com, and through those you can find all of our social media, and that's probably the easiest way to do it.
Awesome. And Gretchen, how about you?
I'm on Twitter at Gretchen_writes, and you can email me at GretchenEvansWrites@gmail.com.
Awesome. Again, thanks to everybody for being here, and thank you very much to Con-Tinual and the Billings, Montana Public Library Random Fandoms series. This has been our panel, and I guess now we're done.